I love a good narrative as much as the next guy. I love the idea of EA screwing up Battlefront 2 and everybody freaking out on them, Disney wanting to hold their feet to the fire, investors bailing and their stock dropping. I like that overarching idea that big greedy corporations get what is coming to them. The unfortunate reality is that quite often isn't the case, and often there's way more that goes into these events than just meets the eye. And that's why I at least think it's my fiduciary duty to the viewer to call out this crap when people are saying things that just aren't true for easy clicks. So today I'm going to debunk the idea that we just went through another gaming crash and that all of these big corporations are having their luck finally catch up to them, because it isn't. Now, just to be clear, this is more in response to a YouTube video that I saw that was going around comparing the current drops in game company stocks to the gaming crash of 1983, saying that we're going into a reset and that microtransactions are going to be pulled from games. It's a very optimistic outlook. The issue is that this individual has no freaking idea what they're talking about. And so I figured I would correct the record, but I don't want anybody going after this individual because he's trying to be optimistic and keep people upbeat, but it's just not true. What I mean is that we need to look at the gaming crash of 1983 and then actually compare it to what just happened. The gaming crash of 1983 was such a drastic informative event, you really can't compare it to anything that's happened before or since. Even the housing market crash of 2008 in the US and across the world, it really doesn't compare. It was such a drastic event that it is pretty much completely unique in the broad history of stock markets, which is why it's still taught in financial schools and business schools today as such an exceptional event, because it was so weird. So what happened is, back in 1983, the gaming industry was growing quickly and people were very excited about it, and it was roughly a $3.2 billion a year industry. Some numbers have it at 3.5, some at 2.9. We'll just say 3.2 for the sake of consistency. So a $3.2 billion industry is pretty exciting. A lot of companies were getting in the market. A lot of personal computing companies were starting to delve into it and experiment with gaming. And so the market began to get saturated and a lot of different companies started coming in, and you ended up with all sorts of things such as price fighting, and there's a few different names for it. But basically what happens is when two companies, it can be more than two, but we'll just say two companies come in and they're selling a similar product, one company will lower the price to get a competitive advantage against their competitor, and then the competitor will drop their price below, and then it just ends up stepping down till you eventually get to the point where the prices are so low that one company has to fold and then the other can raise their price back up to where they initially were. The issue is when both companies don't have the money to just sit on that loss and keep doing that, both companies end up going bankrupt and everything basically just ends up self-destructing. And that's basically what happened with the gaming industry back in 1983, except it wasn't just a few companies that imploded. What ended up happening was that the consumers completely left the industry. They lost complete interest. That $3.2 billion business, in the span of about a year, that dropped to $100 million. That's a 97% decrease. That is such an insane number. It's almost, you can't even quantify. It's ridiculous. That would be like if all cell phone manufacturers, not just Apple, because that's just one manufacturer, but if all cell phone manufacturers, say they sold 100 million units in a year, and then in 2020 or the next year, whenever, they sold only 3 million units in that year. Clearly, you would look at that and say, okay, well, what was the thing? Like, did they figure out some neural implant that replaced cell phones? Like, clearly something happened where nobody wanted a cell phone anymore. The entire industry basically went belly up in the span of about a year, which in terms of stocks and business is effectively overnight. That's ridiculous. You can't compare that to anything else that's happened in really business history before or since. It's so unbelievably weird, it defies logic. And here's the thing, once again, the narrative often takes over reality. Perception is more important than fact. And what a lot of people think happened was that a lot of companies had trouble maintaining quality, and you ended up with like the ET event where the ET game was so terrible that it ended up being buried in the desert in a landfill. That did happen, and quality control absolutely was a factor, but more than anything, the responsible party for the crash of '83 was the personal computer industry. A lot of people were buying personal computers for the first time, and those personal computers could do everything that your gaming console could do and then some. They could do word processing, they could do accounting calculations, they could do graphical editing with pictures and drawing. They were the cutting edge, and they were way more exciting, and there weren't games that you couldn't get on your PC that you could only get on your console. And so people were just looking at both products, and they said, why would I get the console that can only do one thing when I could have the PC that does everything? It's a no-brainer. Like, of course, it's like landline versus cell phone. Why get a landline when you can have a cell phone that does everything your landline does, but does it portably and can do all of this other stuff as well? And so everybody went to personal computers, and it wasn't until 2.5 years later, roughly in 1985, with the success of the SNES and all those games that were exclusive to that platform, that brought customers back, which is once again why console exclusives are so important to the gaming industry as a whole, because without it, you just end up with people drifting back towards the PC, and then consoles start to die. And it took a long time for the industry to heal. It took a long time for it to recover and get back up to where it was. It took Nintendo a ton of work and a lot of other gaming companies coming in for it to be taken more seriously once again. And so to compare what's currently happening to that crash is just ridiculous. It really, the industry died in 1983 and was reborn in '85. It wasn't like a dip and then a correction back to the status quo where we want it to be. It was death and reborn, because it was such a drastic event that you can't even quantify. I can't even communicate how ridiculous this was. And that's why if you compare it to what's happening now, it's not even comparable. For instance, here I have pulled up two of the stocks of two of the largest gaming producers in the world, EA and Activision Blizzard. And as you can see, yes, their stocks have dropped over the course of the last year, but there's a lot going into this, which I'll explain. In any financial market, everything tends to be fairly self-predictive. So if I, for instance, am pouring a ton of money into Amazon, everybody else sees, oh, a ton of money is being poured into Amazon. I need to go and jump on that stock because everybody's putting money into Amazon, which will inflate the value of my stock. So it's self-predictive in the short term. If everybody's investing in a company, that company will inflate. The thing is, it eventually has to pop, because eventually, once we poured all that money in, all of the investors are going to look around and be like, okay, so why is it worth that much? Why do we pour that much money into it? And they start looking at it, they look at the numbers, and they determine, oh, it's not worth that much. I'm pulling out. I'm going out, and I'm going to take my money and go play somewhere else, because it's not actually worth what the number says. And that's why everything gets pulled out, and then it corrects back to itself, which is why you see, for instance, Amazon shot up to be worth $1 trillion in 2018, but then self-corrected back down around the 800 million mark. 800 billion with a B. And so what happened in the gaming industry, which is a notoriously volatile market, and basically what that means is that it can change any day. One day, Activision could be doing great and could be making a lot of money, and then in the span of a couple months, they're bringing in no money because all of the gamers left and went over to go play Black Ops or whatever it may be. And so it's incredibly risky to invest in a company such as EA or Activision. They're not trustworthy or sturdy stocks. They are highly volatile. And the thing is, investors, it's not that they like certain things more than others. More than anything, investors are looking for certainty. And that's why EA and Activision suffered such losses back in October, September, around those times. If you look at these numbers leading up to it in June and July, EA and Activision were actually doing very, very well. They were reaching all new heights. They were doing very, very well. And it was only once we hit August, September, and October that we saw this big dip where all of the funds dried up. And you see Activision went back up, and then they dropped pretty steeply around November, and everything just bottomed out near the turn of the new year. And this is what we call in finance a market correction. It's not weird, it's not abnormal, it's a correction. It's not in direct response necessarily to a product that was released. So for instance, with EA, of course, if you're looking at EA, you have to consider Battlefield 5. These big drops that happened were usually in response to Battlefield 5 being pushed back, being delayed. Things like that absolutely have an impact. But more than anything, it's just proof positive to the investor that they need to correct for this unhealthy growth in the company where it's spiked too large and it's not actually worth that much. And so they bring it back down to where it's actually probably worth, which is down towards the bottom. And to drive this point home, just look at a company that hasn't had major screw-ups, such as CD Projekt Red. Their stock also dropped significantly around September and October, down bottoming out towards the end of November. And it started to make recoveries, especially as it looks like Cyberpunk 2077 will be coming out soon. But their stock even dropped. And they didn't have a Battlefield 5 screw-up like Activision and like EA did. And so to say that these stock drops are a direct result of corporate screw-ups and treating their customers poorly and all this, I'd like it to be true, but more than anything, it's a market correction. Sure, those things had an impact and spurred on the investors to bail, but it was still going to happen. It was just a matter of time as to when. And so I guess all this brings us to the question, what does this actually mean? It basically, to me, means that the industry is correcting. The industry is healthy. Sure, it's not a 97% drop in sales like we saw in 1983, but that's a good thing. You don't want to crash like that. That crash would ruin the industry and would take years and years and years to recover. I don't see that crash ever happening again. A crash like this, I wouldn't even call it a crash. It's a correction. It's something that any of these CFOs were completely prepared for and saw coming from a mile away. It's actually pretty regular when you look back several years. For instance, here we go back through 2017 as well, and you can see that there was a big stock drop that peaked out around August, and then it started dropping pretty significantly leading into November and December. It happens all the time, especially in the gaming industry, where expectations rise during the summer and then they bottom out and become more realistic in the fall and winter. It just happens. This is cyclical. It's perfectly normal. Now, obviously, if you're looking at this chart, you see this massive drop around October where it bottoms out to levels it hasn't been to since 2016 and 2017. But once again, that's a correction that's perfectly normal. Usually something like this, for instance, once a new president comes into office in the States, or there's a big political shift, things like this happen because a new level of certainty is gained and everybody is comfortable. They feel like they know what's coming, so they can invest their money and do things accordingly. And the money keeps growing and growing and growing. And then eventually the investors look at each other and say, hold on a sec, what are we doing? We got to calm down. Let's calm down. Let's get more realistic. And the stock drops back to where it should be. And everything's still correcting. It's still leveling out. So it's a little early to say as to whether or not this is going to bottom out or if it's going to come back up. But it is important to just note this is a perfectly normal cyclical event in the gaming industry. Does this mean that we shouldn't freak out about things like Battlefront 2 and Battlefield 5? Like, no, of course. We should still freak out. We should still let them know that that's not okay to do. But is it this sort of catastrophic event for those companies? No. They can survive off of that. They make rebounds. And the unfortunate reality for a lot of us is that the people like you and me who are interested in this stuff, who are really interested in gaming and follow the news and all of the anti-consumer crap that they pull, we are in the very vocal minority. The overwhelming majority of people that are playing Battlefront 2 and Battlefield 5 don't give a crap, and they're going to play the game no matter what. One of my roommates, I love him to death, he ends up playing those games no matter what they pull because he likes the game. And can you fault him for that? Probably not, but those people are going to buy the game regardless of whether Activision Blizzard screws up some major release or if EA drops the ball with microtransaction screw-ups in Battlefront 2. They're going to play the games anyway. So we still need to hold their feet to the fire and let them know what's up, but it's not this catastrophic event that everybody's been making it out to be. But that's all from me. Thank you for watching. I love you all. Hopefully you enjoy these types of videos. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. More than anything, I think it's just important that all of us YouTubers and commentators use our skills or our knowledge that we have in our day-to-day life and apply it to our passions, which is what I'm trying to do here, especially because a lot of people in the gaming industry don't necessarily know what all of these stock fluctuations are, or realize that it's a correction that happens pretty regularly. So I think it's important to just communicate that, let everybody know, and to be able to move forward with the truth at the forefront of our minds instead of trying to erect this weird narrative that makes us all feel better about ourselves. But that's just me. Let me know your thoughts. I love you all. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.